Most backpacking trips end with great views, quiet campsites, and another trail crossed off the map. But sometimes, the smallest details on an ordinary hike lead to something no one expected. This story begins in Idaho's Sawtooth National Recreation Area, where a routine backpacking trip slowly turned into an investigation involving fake trail workers, abandoned campsites, and stolen equipment hidden deep in the wilderness. At first, nothing seemed unusual. A permit, a few footprints, and an empty campsite. But each small clue revealed that someone in the backcountry wasn't there to hike. They were pretending to belong. Most hikes end with little more than tired legs, a few photographs, and another trail crossed off a map. The stories in this collection come from places where ordinary backcountry routines gradually revealed situations that were far more unsettling than anyone recognized at first. I took the week off from my job as a survey technician in early October because I wanted one last backpacking trip before snow started closing the higher trails in the Sawtooth National Recreation Area in Idaho. And I deliberately chose a route that passed a remote Forest Service patrol cabin because I preferred trails where someone occasionally checked on conditions rather than completely isolated routes. I was 38 then, comfortable hiking alone after years of working around public land boundaries, and I planned everything carefully, leaving my itinerary with my wife, reserving the required campsite, checking weather forecasts twice, and carrying a satellite messenger I rarely expected to use. The first day followed the plan almost perfectly. The trail climbed through lodgepole pine before opening into granite basins dotted with small alpine lakes reflecting thin autumn sunlight. I stopped twice to photograph fresh snow high on the ridges, and once to clear a fallen branch from a narrow footbridge because it looked like someone could trip over it after dark. By late afternoon, I reached a patrol cabin, a weathered one-room structure sitting beside a meadow where two trails crossed. A seasonal wilderness ranger named Cole was updating the permit board outside while replacing a faded notice about bear-resistant food storage. We talked for 10 minutes about trail conditions farther north. He mentioned that visitor traffic had dropped sharply after Labor Day, making the next several days unusually quiet, and asked me to sign the voluntary trail register even though my permit was already in the system. Before I left, he glanced toward the parking information pinned inside the cabin and casually said, "If you see anyone claiming they came in from Granite Spur today, let me know." I asked why. He shrugged and explained that every vehicle recorded at that trailhead was still sitting in the lot, yet one permit listed a group that supposedly exited that morning. It sounded like a paperwork mistake. We both treated it that way. I hiked another mile before making camp beside a creek, cooked dinner as the temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and listened to the familiar sounds of water sliding over smooth rocks until I fell asleep. The following morning, a layer of frost covered my tent, and I broke camp early because clouds were already gathering over the western ridge. About an hour into the hike, I noticed boot prints crossing the trail at an angle. They weren't unusual by themselves, but they ignored every switchback, cutting directly through steep brush instead of following the maintained path. Whoever made them wasn't trying to travel efficiently. They seemed more interested in moving between overlooks than reaching a destination. I followed the official trail instead, eventually reaching an overlook where the valley opened beneath me. From there, I could see nearly 2 miles of winding trail. Nobody appeared anywhere below. While eating lunch, I heard what sounded like 2 short blasts from a whistle somewhere across the drainage. Rangers sometimes carried whistles during searches, but there had been no reports of missing hikers. The sound came once more, then stopped. Wind shifted through the trees, carrying the smell of wet earth just before light rain began. I packed quickly and continued downhill toward a small backcountry campsite marked on my map. It was occupied by a single tent with no people around, which wasn't particularly strange until I noticed the backpack sitting outside. The hip belt was still buckled, as if someone had removed it in a hurry. A pot rested on a stove without fuel attached. One trekking pole leaned against a tree while the other lay 15 feet away beside the trail. Experienced backpackers usually leave camp tidier than that, especially with rain approaching. I called out several times. Nobody answered. I checked the campsite permit clipped beneath the reservation post. It belonged to a solo hiker due to stay one night before continuing south. Everything suggested someone intended to return shortly, so I waited under a nearby tree for almost 20 minutes. Rain intensified, turning the trail into dark mud. No one came back. Remembering my conversation with Ranger Cole, I marked the campsite location on my map and decided to report it instead of disturbing anything. By the time I reached the patrol cabin, rain had become steady enough that mist drifted between the trees. Cole wasn't outside anymore. I found him inside drying maps near a propane heater while completing weather observations for the district office. When I described the abandoned campsite, he stopped writing immediately. The permit number I remembered matched the same hiker whose vehicle was still listed at Granite Spur despite an earlier recorded exit. He thanked me, logged the report, and radioed the main ranger station. Reception came and went because of the storm, forcing him to repeat details several times. Headquarters asked him to verify the campsite before darkness if possible, because heavier weather was expected overnight. Since I knew the exact location and had already planned to camp nearby anyway, I offered to walk back with him. We left within 15 minutes carrying only essential gear, expecting to find a hiker, delayed by weather, or photographing wildlife. Instead, we found the campsite empty. The tent remained, but the backpack was gone, so was the cooking gear. The only obvious change was that the ground around the fire range showed fresh footprints from at least 3 different pairs of boots. Cole crouched beside the mud without speaking for nearly a minute before quietly asking me whether I'd entered the campsite earlier. I hadn't. One set of prints belonged to lightweight trail runners consistent with the permit holder. Another appeared to come from heavier hiking boots. The third had a distinctive sole pattern with missing tread near the heel. Those tracks led away from camp toward an old horse trail officially closed after a washout years before. Cole photographed everything, marked the location with GPS, and tried his radio again. Static swallowed most of the transmission. Headquarters copied only fragments and advised us to return before dark, rather than continue into deteriorating weather with limited communication. Neither of us liked that decision, but policy existed for good reason. Overnight, the storm strengthened. Rain became sleet, and temperatures dropped below freezing. At first light, additional rangers arrived from the main station, and a formal search began. I stayed because they asked me to walk investigators through exactly what I had seen the previous afternoon. Search teams located the permit holder before noon. He was cold, exhausted, and hiding beneath an overhanging rock shelf nearly a mile from his campsite after becoming separated from 2 men who had approached him claiming they were volunteer trail workers checking for storm damage. According to his account, they persuaded him to help carry what they described as abandoned equipment along the closed horse trail. After hiking well away from the maintained route, he realized neither man knew basic trail maintenance procedures, despite talking confidently about Forest Service work. When he questioned them, they abruptly changed direction. He slipped away during heavy rain and spent the night trying to reach the main trail without a map, because one of the men had taken his pack under the pretense of lightening the load. Searchers eventually recovered his backpack hidden beneath brush not far from an illegal campsite containing stolen climbing gear, portable radios, and forged volunteer identification cards. The 2 suspects escaped before law enforcement reached the area. Investigators believed they had been using closed trails to move stolen outdoor equipment between remote trailheads, while occasionally recruiting unsuspecting hikers to help carry loads, without revealing where they were headed. Months later, one suspect was arrested in another state on unrelated theft charges, but the second was never identified. I returned to the Sawtooth the following autumn and stopped by the same patrol cabin. Ranger Cole had transferred to another forest, and a new ranger had taken over. While signing the trail register, I noticed a laminated notice permanently attached beside it, reminding visitors that Forest Service employees and volunteers always carry visible identification and never ask hikers to transport equipment away from designated trails. The notice looked ordinary to anyone passing through, but I recognized it as a quiet change made because of one strange week when two men understood that looking official for only a few minutes could be enough to convince an experienced hiker to follow them just a little farther into the backcountry than he ever intended. Most people believe the biggest danger on a hiking trail is getting lost. But sometimes the real danger is meeting someone who looks like they belong there. This story comes from a professional photographer exploring the remote backcountry of Colorado's Black Canyon. What started as a routine photography trip slowly uncovered a pattern that park rangers had been quietly tracking for months. And by the time anyone realized what was really happening, it was almost too late. I didn't begin that trip as a hiker at all. I was 29, working as a freelance photographer for an outdoor magazine, and my assignment was to spend 4 days documenting late-season color along the Black Canyon of the Gunnison backcountry routes in Colorado. The editor wanted empty trails, old ranger infrastructure, and the contrast between bright aspens and dark canyon walls after most visitors had gone home. That meant hiking alone through an area where the nearest seasonal ranger contact station was several miles from the main visitor center and often operated by only one employee after October. My schedule wasn't flexible. The magazine needed the photos before the first major snowstorm, and the forecast showed a narrow weather window that would close within 48 hours. I checked in at the contact station shortly after sunrise on a Tuesday. The ranger on duty, a woman named Denise, who looked to be in her 50s, asked more questions than I expected. She wanted to know the color of my pack, the make of my tent, the exact route I intended to photograph, and whether anyone else knew my itinerary besides the permit office. None of those questions were unusual on their own, but she wrote every answer twice, once on my permit and once in a handwritten notebook she kept beside the radio console. When I joked that she had a better memory than I did, she smiled without looking up and said, "Paper remembers longer." Before I left, she pointed toward a weather map pinned beside the door and added one instruction I hadn't heard before. If anyone on the trail claimed to be redirecting hikers because of an emergency closure, verify it at an official trailhead or ranger station before changing plans. She didn't elaborate, and I assumed the reminder came from some previous misunderstanding. The hike began quietly. Thin clouds drifted across the canyon rim, and the cottonwoods near the river had already turned gold. I stopped constantly for photographs, losing time because every bend in the trail offered another composition worth setting up. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was almost an hour behind schedule. I reached my intended campsite just before dusk and noticed another tent about 200 yards away, near a cluster of junipers. The occupant waved once but stayed where he was. We exchanged the usual short conversation across the distance, how far we'd come, whether the weather looked stable, whether bears had been active. He said he had entered from the south trailhead that morning. That answer stayed with me, because the southern trailhead had been temporarily closed for maintenance, according to the permit board I'd read before leaving. I nearly corrected him, but decided I had probably mixed up the trail names. We both turned in early. Around midnight, I woke to the faint crunch of gravel. Not footsteps on the trail, slow movement circling campsites. My tent fabric muted the sound enough that I couldn't judge distance. I unzipped the vestibule carefully and looked outside. Moonlight reflected off pale canyon walls, giving the landscape an almost gray-blue glow. I could see the other camper's tent, but it was zipped shut and completely dark. The sound stopped. I waited another minute before convincing myself an elk had probably wandered through camp. The next morning, the other tent was gone. So were the tracks leading toward the named trail. In their place, I found fresh bicycle tire marks crossing a patch of damp soil, even though bicycles weren't permitted anywhere on that route. They disappeared into rocky ground before I could tell where they came from. I photographed them because they looked unusual enough to include in my notes. The trail climbed steadily toward an overlook where I planned to spend the afternoon shooting canyon shadows. About halfway there, I met two men wearing bright orange safety vests. They carried clipboards and spoke confidently about unstable rock farther ahead. One of them said the overlook had been closed after a small landslide that morning and suggested I use an old maintenance path to bypass the area. He pointed toward a Finkside trail descending through scrub oak. Something about the conversation bothered me. Neither man wore agency patches, and their clipboards contained blank paper visible beneath transparent covers. I asked which office they worked for. The taller one answered, "Regional maintenance," then immediately changed the subject to weather. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but I remembered Denise's comment about verifying unexpected closures. Instead of taking the side trail, I thanked them and said I needed to return to the contact station anyway because I'd forgotten a camera battery. They watched me begin walking back before continuing uphill. I rounded the first bend, stepped off the trail behind a stand of pinyon pine, and waited. Within 30 seconds, both men came back down the trail, much faster than before. They reached the maintenance path they had recommended, disappeared into it, and never looked toward the overlook they had supposedly closed. That was enough for me. I hiked directly back to the ranger station without stopping for photographs. Denise listened without interrupting while I described the encounter. She asked me to point out the location on a topographic map, then picked up the radio. Reception faded twice before she finally reached law enforcement rangers, already investigating another complaint from the previous week. As we waited for them to arrive, she opened the handwritten notebook I'd noticed earlier. It wasn't a diary. It contained descriptions from hikers over nearly 3 months. 2 men in orange vests, temporary closure, suggested alternate trail. No official vehicles. The reports came from different trail systems across the district, each too minor on its own to justify a large response. Most hikers had simply chosen another route and continued their trips. No one had reported a crime because nothing obvious had happened. Law enforcement asked whether I was willing to accompany them back to the junction where I'd met the men. We left within the hour. The maintenance path ended at an abandoned utility road outside the designated hiking area. Hidden beneath camouflage netting were several all-terrain carts loaded with expensive climbing gear, camera equipment, and unopened shipping boxes bearing labels from outdoor retailers. Investigators later concluded the group had been intercepting hikers, steering them away from certain sections of trail while using those temporarily empty routes to move stolen property between remote pickup points. The false trail closures reduced the chance that anyone would accidentally encounter them during transfers. More surprising was how long the pattern had continued. Denise's notebook documented nearly 20 similar interactions stretching back to midsummer. None had seemed serious enough individually. Together they formed a map of deliberate deception. Officers arrested one suspect that evening after locating a vehicle at an isolated forest road, but at least 2 others escaped into neighboring public land before search teams closed the area. My assignment ended early because portions of the backcountry were temporarily restricted while the investigation continued. The magazine eventually published my photographs, along with a brief mention that several trails had closed because of a law enforcement operation. They never included the real reason, and I understood why. Publicizing every detail would only encourage copycats. A year later, I returned to photograph the same canyon under nearly identical autumn light. The contact station had a new permit board, updated maps, and a larger sign explaining that all legitimate trail closures would appear on official notices displaying the park seal and effective dates. Denise had retired by then. The ranger replacing her recognized my name from the old incident report and casually mentioned that hikers still occasionally reported people giving unofficial directions on remote trails. But every investigation ended with nothing more than vague descriptions and empty side roads. As I signed the trail register before leaving, I noticed the notebook Denise had kept wasn't on the counter anymore. In its place sat a printed logbook with standardized forms. It looked cleaner, more organized, and probably easier to archive. What it couldn't show was the patterns she had recognized only because she had spent an entire season writing down small conversations that everyone else, including me at first, had dismissed as forgettable. I was 46 when I decided to hike the Lost Coast Trail in Northern California during the last week of November, a time when most people had already packed away their backpacks for the season. I had spent nearly 20 years inspecting bridges for a state transportation agency, and after months of looking at concrete and steel, I liked disappearing into places where the only schedule belonged to tides and weather. The Lost Coast appealed to me because it demanded planning. You couldn't simply walk whenever you wanted. Sections of beach disappeared beneath high tide, forcing hikers to move within narrow windows or wait for the ocean to retreat. I studied tide tables for weeks, printed them instead of relying on my phone, and checked in at the Bureau of Land Management Trail Contact Office before starting. The ranger there, a younger guy named Marcus, looked over my itinerary and quietly suggested I make one small adjustment. The man wants the moon, wants the moon, wants the moon. Instead of stopping at the campsite I'd chosen for my second night, he recommended another location about 3 miles farther south. When I asked why, he hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then he said the northern site had become popular with people who ignored camping regulations and occasionally intimidated other hikers. Nothing violent had been reported, but enough complaints had accumulated that he preferred steering solo backpackers elsewhere. It sounded reasonable. I accepted the suggestion and headed out. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. Gray waves rolled against black sand. Driftwood logs the size of train cars rested above the tide line. Harbor seals watched from offshore rocks, while gulls argued over shellfish left behind by the receding water. The trail wasn't really a trail for long stretches. It was simply the coastline itself. Every few hours I checked my watch against a tide chart folded inside my map case. Missing a crossing by even 30 minutes could leave you trapped against cliffs until the next cycle. That pressure kept everyone moving at roughly the same pace. By late afternoon, I reached a broad stretch of beach where I stopped to photograph sunlight breaking beneath a layer of coastal clouds. Another hiker appeared in the distance, pushing hard to beat the incoming tide. We met briefly at a narrow point where waves nearly reached the cliffs. He introduced himself as Nate, said he'd started that morning from the opposite trailhead, and mentioned seeing an abandoned inflatable raft hidden above the high water mark several miles back. We both laughed because it seemed like such an impractical thing to carry into that landscape. Neither of us thought much more about it. I reached my campsite just before dark. 2 other hikers occupied the southern end of the beach, far enough away that we exchanged only a wave. The night passed quietly except for the constant surf and wind rattling the tent fabric. Early the next morning, I noticed something odd while packing. Fresh footprints crossed the damp sand between my campsite and the bluff behind it. They had been made after midnight because the evening tide would have erased anything older. What drew my attention wasn't the prints themselves, but where they led. They stopped at the bluff instead of continuing inland or back along the beach. I climbed the short slope expecting to find another campsite hidden among the brush. Instead, I found flattened grass overlooking the beach, empty food wrappers, and cigarette butts still dry despite the heavy overnight mist. Someone had spent time watching the shoreline from above. I assumed it was local fishermen until I realized there was no practical route for them to reach that overlook without hiking several miles. I took a few photographs out of habit and continued south. The weather changed by noon. Thick fog rolled in from the Pacific, reducing visibility to perhaps 100 yards. The coastline became strangely quiet because the fog absorbed sound, making the waves seem farther away than they actually were. I checked my GPS only to confirm what I already knew. I needed to reach the next tidal pinch point before the water rose again. About half a mile before the crossing, I met a couple heading north. They asked whether I'd seen a ranger farther back because someone had warned them that the southern beach was temporarily closed due to unstable cliffs. That immediately caught my attention because Marcus had reviewed every current closure with me before the trip. There hadn't been any. I asked who told them. They described a middle-aged man wearing a dark green jacket with a shoulder patch. They assumed he worked for the BLM because he carried a handheld radio clip to his belt. They turned around without questioning him. I kept walking, but now every person ahead became more interesting than the scenery. Near the tidal crossing, I found no closure signs, no rockfall, and no ranger vehicle at the inland access road. The beach remained completely open. As the tide receded, I crossed without difficulty. A mile later, I found the first piece of equipment that didn't belong there, a portable VHF radio antenna leaning against driftwood beneath camouflage netting. It wasn't connected to anything. The coaxial cable had been cut cleanly with tools, and fresh boot prints surrounded the area. I marked the GPS location and continued because there was no radio coverage to report it. That afternoon, I reached the small seasonal ranger support cabin used during busier months. It stood empty for the winter, but an emergency satellite phone remained secured as a locked weather box for public use. The phone worked. Marcus answered after I was transferred through dispatch. When I described the fake closure report in the antenna, his tone changed immediately. He asked me to stay at the cabin until law enforcement arrived by vehicle from the southern access road. They estimated 3 hours. I spent that time helping another hiker repair a broken trekking pole and watching fog drift across the beach. Shortly before sunset, a white pickup appeared on the inland service track. It carried amber warning lights but no agency markings. It stopped roughly 300 yards from a cabin. Nobody got out. A minute later, it reversed, turned around, and disappeared back into the trees. When deputies and BLM officers finally arrived after dark, they found fresh tire tracks matching the pickup, but no vehicle. The next morning, I accompanied investigators to the antenna site. Searching the surrounding brush revealed several waterproof storage bins hidden beneath fallen branches. Inside were expensive cameras, satellite communicators, climbing hardware, laptops sealed in plastic bags, and handwritten lists describing which days different sections of the trail usually saw the fewest hikers. None of the property belonged to current visitors. Much of it had been reported stolen months earlier from vehicles parked at remote trailheads across Northern California. Investigators eventually reconstructed what they believed. It was convenient to see that the days were too high and too hot were well. Then the first went to wear a chair. A small group had been using false ranger warnings to redirect hikers away from selected beach sections whenever they needed to move stolen equipment between inland access roads and hitting shoreline caches. The portable radio gear wasn't intended to impersonate emergency communications directly. It allowed them to monitor publicly accessible frequencies and avoid legitimate ranger patrols. The abandoned inflatable raft Nate had mentioned made sense too. During especially high tides, they apparently floated sealed containers around impassable headlands instead of carrying them over difficult terrain. The operation had probably continued unnoticed, because every individual encounter seemed harmless. A hiker received incorrect directions. Another turned around because of a supposed closure. Someone spotted odd equipment but assumed it belonged to researchers. None of those moments alone justified a major investigation. Together, they revealed a carefully rehearsed system built around the isolation of the coastline and the fact that most visitors expected anyone carrying a radio or wearing outdoor work clothes to be legitimate. Several arrests followed over the next few months after detectives connected the recovered property to an organized theft ring targeting remote trailhead parking areas throughout the region. Officially, the case was closed. That wasn't the part I remembered most. About 6 months later, I received copies of my photographs because investigators no longer needed them as evidence. While reviewing the images on my computer, I stopped on one taken during that first afternoon when I had been photographing sunlight breaking through the clouds. Far in the background, almost lost against the driftwood, sat the same white pickup that later backed away from the ranger cabin. It had been there from the beginning of my trip, parked well beyond where any public vehicle should have been, and I had never noticed it until the investigation taught me exactly where to look.